Hey, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador. This is my review of Sony's FE 300mm f2.8 G Master with optical steady shot. Now this comes with quite a gap from two previous G Master Prime lenses that are favoured by sports photographers and perhaps bird photographers as well. We saw the 400mm G Master in 2018 released, and then a year later the 600mm. But a lot of sports photographers have been requesting a sports prime of the 300mm focal length, and now we have that lens, the FE 300mm f2.8 G Master, and it is a cracker, as you will see. Now I always say this about pretty much all of the Sony late model releases, which is that it's smaller, lighter and faster. Now it is smaller than the 400 and 600mm prime. It's not going to be smaller than all of the telephoto zooms, but you are going to be surprised when I show you that in comparison. Now this creates a trilogy of telephoto prime lenses, and perhaps one of the surprising things is not just that it is significantly smaller and lighter than the 400 and 600, it is also significantly cheaper as well. Now that is an approximate price that I'm showing there. Now I am reviewing this in Australia, so it's a little bit difficult getting a recommended retail price of the American price, but expect it to be perhaps half the price of the 600 and maybe the 400mm telephoto primes. And so this is going to be an attractive lens for perhaps photographers who are not pro sports photographers. Now it's going to be a little bit short for perhaps bird photographers, but as you'll see in this review, it does lend itself to a large variety of genres of photography. Let's just start with the specs. 10.5 inches long, 5 inches wide, predominantly because of that large front element lens there. We've got 3.24 pounds or 51.9 ounces, and we don't put filters on the front of these lenses. We use 40.5mm drop-in filters in a little drawer at the back of the lens, and I'll discuss that later. If you're working in metrics, that's 1.47 kilograms, 265mm long, 124 millimeters in diameter. What is this lens good for if you're not a pro sports shooter? Would you shoot wildlife with this? And actually, I have shot a lot of wildlife in this review period, so I would give that a resounding check, because you're going to see a lot of wildlife. This lens review coincided with a weekend location shoot where it was predominantly based on wildlife. When I shoot smaller wildlife, such as birds sitting in trees? And the answer is absolutely yes. We are going to get a great deal of figure ground separation with this. We also can shoot birds in flight because it is an extremely fast focusing lens with those linear XT focus motors, which make this a real sporting classic. So I give that the tick of approval as well. Portraits, now I wasn't shooting human portraits this particular review period, but I was shooting a lot of animal portraits, so I'm going to give that a check as well. All of the portraits you will be seeing are wildlife portraits, but if you just take a look at the figure ground separation, the bokeh in the background, you are going to get a clear idea. This is going to be very attractive. If you're thinking a sort of 135, 1.8 sort of figure ground separation with that bokeh, you're going to get a similar or even better bokeh with this 300mm f2.8, and that's courtesy of the 11 blade circular aperture. I'll give a tick of approval for that one. Action, yes, of course, we are going to get a very good fast action. Hopping kangaroos. I often shoot dogs running on beaches to test the focus performance of these telephoto lenses, but this weekend it was kangaroos in full flight. So again, a tick of approval for there. Now, you might not consider a 300mm sporting prime as possibly for shooting nature. It doesn't have a great close focusing distance, but it's good enough. We're looking at perhaps 6 feet or 2 meters, and given that it's a 300mm prime, we are going to get quite close to magnify that stuff sufficiently, such as small leaves on trees and perhaps even butterflies, as you can see from this particular shot. You are going to improve that magnification ratio by just dropping on one of those teleconverters if you want to get even closer to this small stuff. Okay, another atypical use of one of these telephoto primes is maybe for landscape. Now, a lot of people just go straight to the 1635 G Masters for this type of work, but I would also encourage you to maybe explore landscape photography using that perspective compression in order to record some landscape. And this could be urban landscapes, or it could be natural landscapes, but you are going to get some very interesting effects by shooting it with a 300mm focal length. So I'm going to give that one a tick of approval as well. Let's come back to why Sony developed this lens, and that is primarily for sports photographers. Now, a lot of the sports photographers wanting the shorter 300mm focal length are working in smaller stadiums, maybe sort of basketball, where you're actually a lot closer to the sports people, so you don't need that 400 and 600mm focal length, but you do need that ultra wide aperture because you might be shooting in low light, and you also want to blur the crowd or spectators in the background. Now, this is a cricket shot, and this is a much larger playing field than you might see perhaps in soccer or rugby or American football, gridiron football. But it does show you that I can actually get close enough for a full figure action shot with a 300mm shorter focal length. So I'm going to give the Sport a tick of approval even if you don't own the 400 or 600 lens. So I'm going to say this is good for up to a 500 feet playing field, and that pretty much covers everything that you want to cover in the sport genre there. So another tick of approval for that. Now, if you want to get real closer to the action, maybe half-length portraits, you can actually do this with the 300mm sporting lens by adding a 1.4 times teleconverter that pushes out the focal length to 420mm. And then if I drop into APS-C mode on one of the high-resolution cameras such as the Alpha 1 or Alpha 7R cameras, you are going to get a full frame equivalent angle of view of 630mm, and in many instances that's good enough for most sports. So I'm going to give that another tick of approval. That's a double tick for sports there. What I am coming down to saying is basically this lens is suitable for all and any of the above that I've just mentioned. So again, it's smaller, lighter and faster, and that is going to be a very attractive feature for a lot of people looking for photographing things where they want bokeh, but also where the subjects are going to be moving very rapidly indeed. I think the best way of showing you the form factor of this new 300 G Master is to show it alongside two other lenses that I own. Here on my right we have the 400 F2.8 G Master. Now, this is a lens that I absolutely love and will use for both sports and wildlife photography. It is quite a sizable lens, and you do get this accompanying Pelican case to carry it around with. It will just fit in my large backpack that I also own with camera attached. But the 300 F2.8 G Master, however, comes in a much smaller bag because it is indeed a much smaller lens. And as soon as you pick it up, you also notice another major difference is its weight. It is a lot lighter than the 400 and 600 G Master lenses. So perhaps if I compare this with a lens you might already be familiar with, such as the 100-400 G Master, which I have here, we can see that, yes, the new 300 2.8 G Master is a larger lens, but of course it has to collect a lot more light. And also, if we zoom this lens to the 300mm focal lengths like so, you'll see it actually extends to the same height. Now, the weight of this 300 2.8 G Master is also closer to the camera, so it doesn't feel particularly heavy compared to the 100-400. In fact, this new 300 2.8 is only a couple of ounces or 75 grams heavier than the 100-400. Now, of course, we've got a difference in the diameter at the front, and that's because this new 2.8 G Master has to collect 4 times more light for its 2-stop advantage. But of course, with that 2-stop advantage, you get better focus in low ambient light. You're going to get a lot more bokeh or figure ground separation between your subject and the background. And of course, your ISO will also be significantly lower, basically shooting at a quarter of the ISO had you been using this one at f5.6. So the size form factor could be one of the compelling reasons that you may be considering this new 300 f2.8 G Master. Let's take a look at the competing 300mm primes from other manufacturers. Now I have to say there isn't a lot that is directly comparable with this new 2023 300mm prime. We're looking at these 4 examples were designed and released a long time ago. The Sigma dates back to 2005 and has been discontinued. The Nikon, I believe, is a 2009 lens. The Canon is a 2010. So we've got a lens that is much more modern, 13, 14 years newer than these lenses that we're looking at here. And it is considerably lighter. It's nearly a kilo lighter than the Canon and 1.5 kilos lighter than that Nikon. So there it is. There's the lighter and faster element of this new Sony 300 2.8. If we look at that in direct comparison, it's not necessarily smaller than the Nikon and Canon lenses. We do need that total length with that large front element for collecting large amounts of light with that big f2.8 aperture, but it is the weight advantage here. Now that weight is sitting towards the camera body. It's much closer to you than further towards that front element, and so it does feel very light. It feels as light as if you're using a 100-400 telephoto zoom. So that is saying quite a lot about this new lens. If we drop on a 2 times teleconverter on this 300 to push it up to that 600mm focal length and compare it with Sony's 200-600, we see that it is lighter and shorter in length than that 200-600 telephoto zoom. But you are getting a significantly wider aperture. We would be shooting at f6.3 on that 200-600 and f2.8 on the new Sony Prime. So let's take a look at Sony's other 300mm sporting options. We really need to look at the lenses, the white lenses with those linear XD focus motors. So we do have that 100-400 5.6. It's perhaps one of the older fast focusing lenses that was announced and released on the same day as the A9. So that was definitely a great companion for that original A9 sporting camera. But we're shooting with a maximum aperture of f5.6 on that 100-400. You could use the 70-200 f2.8 G Master 2 with the fast XD linear focus motors with a 1.4 times teleconverter. That pushes out the focal length to 280 millimeters, but now we've dropped one aperture down to f4. So yes, you are going to pay a lot more money for that 300mm prime, but you have got that one stop advantage. So one stop over the 70-200 with a 1.4, 2 stops over that 100-400 G Master. Let's take a look at maybe if you're wanting to shoot at a 600mm focal length. So of course we could perhaps look at that 100-400 with a 1.4 times teleconverter. We could look at the 200-600 at the 600mm focal length. We could look at the Sony 300mm with a ×2 teleconverter, and also Sony's G Master Prime, that 600mm f4. Now the 300mm is an excellent option. You'll see that we're not too much heavier than the 100-400. We're actually lighter than the 200-600, and we're actually a lot shorter than that 200-600. But if you're looking for absolute maximum aperture, then of course that Sony 600mm f4 G Master will give you that f4 aperture, which is a one-stop advantage over putting the 2 times teleconverter on the 300mm prime. But of course, if you are going to have a big cost saving by investing in the 300 with that 2 times teleconverter when and if you need that 600mm reach. Now, to give you an example of when I would need a 600mm reach, I recently returned from the Australian MotoGP races. Unfortunately, this was a spectacularly bad timing for reviewing this new lens, because I was notified that the new lens existed 3 or 4 days after after getting back from the MotoGP, and I would have dearly loved to have tested this 300mm prime at the Australian MotoGP. So what you see me there using is the 400mm G Master Prime with a 1.4 times teleconverter, and when I need additional reach depending on the corner that I'm shooting from, I can get that 840mm angle of view in APS-C with a 1.4 times teleconverter. Now that 400mm at some corners is actually quite tight. This is an uncropped image of one of the Japanese riders, and you can see that I don't actually get to the entire motorcycle in at that 400mm focal length. And so some corners would be better served by using a slightly shorter focal length. Now this is the 400 is absolutely great for these tight shots, but it does require a certain amount of skill to pan so accurately that you can get most of the motorcycle into the frame with this 400 G Master. You are rewarded, of course. You don't always have to get the entire motorcycle in the shot, because some of these detail shots of these guys riding at over 100 kilometers per hour is spectacular, and this gives you a sense of what these telephoto primes are absolutely capable of if you're also able to pan with those slower shutter speeds, which is sort of a go for the auto sports photographers. So here's that 400mm. A slight fail in this instance. I would have preferred to have got the front wheel in, and I've actually got the back wheel in. So this is really too tight in most instances. There's me showing the crop or the uncropped file. The only thing I'm doing is going to the 16:9 aspect ratio here, but I can't recover any more of that front wheel because it was cropped in camera. Here's another example of the too tight cropping that a 400mm will give you in some sporting environments. And again, showing you this is a Australian rider, Jack Miller, and just going, I've got all of the motorcycle in, well, just about, but it's extremely tight. And when you're panning at these guys traveling at over 100 kilometers an hour, it does require a certain amount of skill. So this is where the 300mm focal length comes in, and I was actually shooting with a 70-200 in APS-C mode to give me that 300mm equivalent angle of view. And you can see it's much more comfortable now to get the full motorcycle in the shot, and it does allow me some wiggle room so that I can recompose a shot if I want to skew this at a dramatic angle across the frame if I want to, whereas the 400 would be too tight in order to do this. Now let's take a look at some of the specifications of this lens. So we've got pretty much all of the bells and whistles that we would see on the 400 and 600. We don't have a preset focus function that we will find on the 400-600, which allows you to keep pulling back to the same registered focus point. But we've pretty much got everything else, and that includes the AF/MF switch, the full-time DMF. This is really important on very long telephoto lenses, where if everything is blurred, we can just pull the focus ring very, very quickly in AFC, continuous autofocus, to pull a little bit more focus so the autofocus kicks back in as soon as it recognizes that there is a subject there to be focused on. We have the focus limiter, we have the optical steady shot on-off switch, we have 3 steady shot modes. That third one is very useful for very erratic or rapid moving action. We've got the 4 custom keys. They're all programmed to the same function. It just means that if you're shooting in either vertical orientation, you're always going to have a custom key or focus hold button right underneath your thumb. You're not going to be struggling or reaching for one of those custom keys. We also have something that is only found on these telephoto G Master primes, which is a function ring, and I'll talk about that shortly. We have a Loctite lens hood, which is a redesigned sturdy version of the lens hoods we've seen on the 400-600, and we have that drop-in filter that I've already discussed. So here is that function ring. It basically just clicks left or right with a rotation, and this can be programmed to do one of 2 operations: do a smooth zoom if you're using clear image zoom, or go from full frame mode into APS-C mode. Now, the zoom function is the default for some strange reason because you will need to go into the menus and assign the crop. You don't want to be coming back to a custom key on the camera with these long telephoto prime lenses. You just want to be able to click to zoom in. This helps you see where the action is or maybe see where the ball is. So, and because we're now using very rich resolution sensors, that is very important. And we're still going to have a 20 or 26 megapixel image when we can crop again in post, even when shooting in APS-C mode. Okay, we got that new Loctite lens hood. This is much quicker to attach and detach than the lens hoods we've seen designed for the 400 and 600 millimeter telephoto primes. And we've also got that drop-in filter. Now, as I said, you're not going to put a massive filter on the front of these lenses. You're actually going to put a small 40.5 millimeter filter into this filter drawer. The Sony price is close on 400 American dollars, but you can pick up smaller, cheaper filters online. Now, I have seen one of the sports photographers I was shooting at the MotoGP buying a non-Sony filter and putting it in that filter drawer, but he did have to file it down a little bit so it actually fitted in the filter drawer. Okay, so you got choices there: a cheap filter modified to fit the filter drawer, or maybe the Sony filter. And if you're looking for absolute premium quality, I know it comes at a cost, but you might lean towards that Sony filter there. Why would you need to put a filter on a lens that collects a lot of light? Here's a prime example from a MotoGP. So I'm slowing the shutter speed down to 1/320th of a second to get some movement blur behind this racing motorcycle. Now I'm at the minimum ISO of the ISO auto range there, so 100. So I have to actually close down to F8 in sunny conditions to actually pull an exposure that won't overexpose those bright highlights. But of course, you've just invested in an F2.8 lens, so you need a 3-stop ND so you can enjoy both the F2.8 maximum aperture and also use those slow shutter speeds. And that is the reason that most sports photographers will be using a drop-in filter on these type lenses. Let's take a look at the subject of the teleconverters, because you are getting a massive saving by buying the 300 instead of the 400 or 600, but you'll probably want to attach a teleconverter in order to get that extra reach because you don't have the 400 or 600 lenses. So I'm going to show you some examples of the quality you can expect to achieve when using these teleconverters. This is pretty much an uncropped image, except again I'm cropping to the 16:9 aspect ratio, so you're seeing this is basically filling your screens. But this is giving me a true focal length of 420 millimeters. Now I captured this at 1/2000th per second. This parrot was startled by another bird coming in to attack it because it was just feeding too close to a nesting site. Here's another uncropped image, again 420 millimeters with a 1.4 times teleconverter, and you can see very rich detail. We're not losing anything significantly in the detail stakes because it is super sharp without the teleconverters, so it is more than sharp enough for me, especially when using that 1.4 teleconverter. Again, another example, getting very close to some kangaroos just before sunset here. 420 millimeters again. This again is not a cropped image. This is where we are cropping in because we're now shooting subjects that are much smaller. So I'm now using the 1.4 times teleconverter and doing the maximum amount of crop on this alpha 1 file to come down to the 4K resolution. So I'm cropping down from over 8,000 pixels wide to 3,840, which is the 4K pixel dimensions. So this is effectively a 2.25 times crop, and I have a full frame equivalent angle of view of 945 millimeters by using this 300 millimeters with a teleconverter and cropping in post. Again, another reason I might like to crop is because I've hit the minimum focusing distance and I need to go in real tight in post-production. So again, I'm only coming in with a 1.5 times crop in post-production now, but we've got that equivalent, full frame equivalent angle of view of 630 millimeters. Let's put on the 2x teleconverter. Now, I'm always preferring to crop first before using the teleconverters, and I'll always use the 1.4 times teleconverter before resorting to the 2x teleconverter. In some instances, I have noticed a slight fall off of sharpness with using the 2x, but I was very surprised to find out I wasn't noticing this significant fall off of detail when using the 2x teleconverter on this 300 G Master. So if we look at the fine detail that you can see on this little bird here, this is cropping in as well as using the teleconverter. So I'm actually zooming closer to that fine feather detail you can see there. Let's show you some more examples of the sort of detail you can expect when using this 2x teleconverter and cropping in on your computers. So again, you can see rich detail in that fur and in the whiskers of this kangaroo here. Let's take a look at this 600mm view, and again cropping into 100%. So we're seeing actual pixels now, and we're looking at the fine detail and also the eyelashes. And again, I don't think anybody will be complaining too much with the 2x teleconverter on this 300mm G Master. Another example, 2x teleconverter, cropping in 100%. What I'll do with these images I'm showing is I will put a link in the information below so you can look at high resolution versions, which I don't have the movie compression on my Flickr Pro account. And in most of the images I'll be posting, you can actually click to zoom in to do a final check on the detail that you're seeing. So when I'm talking about sharpness, really it is in the eyes of the beholder. If you think it's sharp enough when you click and zoom in, then that's how sharp it is. Let's go for the maximum crop again with this bird in flight. 2.25 times crop on an alpha 1 file with a 2x teleconverter is giving me a 1350mm full frame equivalent angle of view. So even though it's a 300mm, you can get that extra reach when using it in combination with the teleconverters and also cropping down to 4K in post-production. Now, of course, when we're using the 2x teleconverter, we are losing 2 stops of light. So if the effective aperture is F2.8 in terms of exposure. So in some instances, when I was shooting wildlife on this location shoot, in the low light, especially in the woodland areas that I was shooting in the forest, the ISO was creeping up. In this particular example, I'm shooting at ISO 2500. But again, I'll zoom into that 100% magnification, and if you're looking for the noise, basically it's not there because I've done a noise reduction inside of Lightroom. So I think the days where we might complain about high ISO or the fact that we're not shooting with an ultra wide aperture perhaps are disappearing with these new AI noise suppression software that we've got, such as from DxO, Topaz, and also Adobe software. Smaller, lighter, faster, and I would also say this is a very flexible lens. Whether you're a sports shooter or not, you're going to get a very distinctive look by shooting at 300mm with a maximum aperture of f2.8, and it does give you the opportunity of getting a longer reach without losing too much light by using the teleconverters. Okay, if you need additional support, if you will want to access the raw files that I will be sharing with my patrons on patreon.com, just head over to patreon.com/Mark Ayler. You will have available, if you're using a late model alpha camera, you will be able to download a 600 page ebook for your camera. I have over 20 hours of movie seminars, masterclass seminars that you can watch, and I also have camera setup files, camset files for your late model cameras as well. And there's just an overview of all of the ebooks I've made available over the last 3, 4, 5 years for the late model alpha cameras. Okay, if you've enjoyed this review, just give me the thumbs up, make sure you subscribe, and head over to patreon.com/Mark Ayler if you want to check out the wealth of resources that I provide for my patrons. Okay, I'll catch you online next time.